Welcome to the Chambers Street Theater. We did our little special effects there. That was Mark Twain. I'm sure you already know that. We like to have him sit in the chair when we do a Mark Twain show because he was such a very wonderful writer and such a great presence. Well, I'm just Ruth Chambers. I do the best I can. Today, we're going to be reading from Mark Twain, and we have our help here in the control room. There are three of us who do this show every week. We've got Alex Silva-Satter and Bryce Parker, two very talented technical people who have come up with some wonderful special effects. We're going to have some other, perhaps unintentional, special effects because they're working on the building here. And so you might hear something like plumbing noises or hammering. Oh, just enjoy it. It's wonderful DC TV, and sometimes we have to repair things here, and that's what they're doing. They're just repairing some things. So think of it as frogs doing repair work inside the building somewhere, because we don't have frog sounds like singing or croaking, but we do have repair people hammering and adjusting things. Anyway, today is the special day. We're going to be reading The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, and of course, oh, there we go. Thank you very much. They're the technical people, are doing a wonderful job with the jumping frog, and we're going to have special effects like that, and well, I think it's just going to look pretty good. Well, The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County was the short story that made Mark Twain famous. Before that, he had been a little bit of everything. He had been a man who came from Missouri, was a riverboat captain. He came out west with his brother to Nevada. He worked on several newspapers, being a reporter. He then came out to California. In Nevada, they had the silver rush, and in California, they had the gold rush. And there you see the map where Calaveras County is in California. And Mark Twain came out here, and he did some gold prospecting with some friends, and they weren't very successful. And they camped out at Lake Tahoe, and their campfire got out of control and burned most of Tahoe down. So he just wasn't very successful at things. And then he wrote this story, and it was a story he heard. He heard it in Angels Camp. That's a city along Highway 49 for 1849, about this jumping frog. And now you see a little frog there who's just as cute as he can be. And this story, he went home and wrote it up after he heard it in the Angels Camp Hotel. And it was later published in a magazine, the last issue of a magazine back east. And it became immensely popular, not only in this country, but in England and all over the world. Everybody loves a good put-on story, and if this isn't it, I don't know what is. And so we're going to read The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. In compliance with a request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do. And I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of the infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to be. If that was the design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom store of the dilapidated tavern in the decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me a good day. I told him that a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley. Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angels Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence, and he never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm. But all through the interminable narrative, there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on his way and never interrupted him once. Reverend Leonidas W. Reverend Lee, well, there was a fella here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, though, makes me think it was one or the other, because I remember the big flu weren't finished when he come to the camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so he got his bet, he was satisfied. But still he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned that feller'd offered to bet on it. And take any side you please, as I was telling you. If there were a horse race, you'd find him flush, or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there were two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best extorter about here. And so he was, too, and a good man. If he even seen a straddled bug start to go anywhere, he would bet you how long it would take him to get to to wherever he was going to, and if you took him up, he would foller that straddlebug to Mexico. But what he would find there, where he was bound for and how long he was on the road. Lots of the boys here had seen that Smiley and can tell you about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything. The darndest fella. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning he come in and Smiley up and asked him how she was. And he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that with the blessing of Providence she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, "Well, I'll risk 2.5 she don't anyway." This here Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag. But that was only in fun, you know, because of course she was faster than that, and he used to win money on that horse. For all she was so slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind, they used to give her 200 or 300 yards start and then pass her underway. But always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate-like and come cavorting and straddling up and scatting her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, and sometimes out to one side along the fences and kicking up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up the stand just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a small bull pup that to look at him you'd think he wasn't worth a cent, but to set around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw began to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times, and Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on, but he was satisfied and hadn't expect nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up. And then all of a sudden, he would grab that other dog just by the joint in his hind leg and freeze to it. Not chaw, you understand, but only just grip and hang on till they throwed up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always come out winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs, 'cause they'd been sawed off in a circular saw, and when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up, how it'd be, well, he come to make a snatch for his pet hold to see in a minute how he'd been imposed upon and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak, and he peered surprised, and then he looked sort of discouraged like and didn't say no more to win the fight. And so he got all shucked out bad. He give Smiley a look, as much as to say his heart was broke, and that it was his fault for putting up a dog that hadn't no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. It was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd lived. For the stuff was in him, and he had genius I know it, because he hadn't no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he didn't have no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his'n and the way it turned out. Well, this here Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all kind of them things, till you couldn't rest and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on but he'd match you. He fetched a frog one day and took him home and said he calculated to educate him. And so he never done nothing for 3 months, but sat in his backyard and learned that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn him too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. See him turn one somersault, or maybe a couple, if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of fetching flies, it kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail the fly every time as far as you could see him. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I seen him set Daniel Webster down there on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies." And quicker'n you could wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off the counter there and flop down on the floor again, as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot, as indifferent as if he hadn't no idea he'd been doing any more than any frog might do. You never seen a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit. You understand? And when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellas that had traveled and been everywheres all said he laid over any frog that they ever see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him out downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger to the camp he was, come across him with his box and says, "What might it be you got in that box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it careful and turned it round this way and that and says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and took another long, particular look and give it back to Smiley and says very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and he says, kind of sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I'd bet you." Then Smiley says, "That's all right. That's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." And so the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and pried his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot. Filled him pretty near up to his chin and set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched a frog and fetched him in and give him to the feller and says, "Now, if you're ready, we'll set him alongside of Daniel with his 4 paws, just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, "Git!" And him and the feller tetched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively, but Daniel gave a heave and hoisted up his shoulders so like a Frenchman, but it weren't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted solid as a church, and he couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too. But he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulders so at Daniel and says again, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley, he stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and at last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow." And then he catched Daniel up by the nape of the neck and hefted him and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds, and turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took after that fella, but he never catched him." And here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard and got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me as he moved away, he said, "Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't going to be gone a second." But by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley. So I started away. At the door, I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. "Well, this here Smiley had a yeller, one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, just a short stump like a banana, and, however, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave." And there you have the jumping frog of Calaveras County. I love the story, and it is wonderful. And can you imagine the first people in the East to read this story didn't like it and passed it around, thought it wasn't appropriate. And then it finally got printed in a dying little quarterly magazine, and it was the last issue of that magazine. And it kind of revived the magazine because everybody wanted to have a copy of the Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And it became world famous. And Mark Twain then was able to go east, and he could write his other stories then. He wrote, of course, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, and my favorite, Roughing It. If you've never read Roughing It, you just need to. He has written about the gold rush and silver times, and if he hadn't read that book, we just wouldn't know the things that had happened then, because he was right there on the ground, to use his own phrase. That's what he said about him being there and writing about this. I was right here on the ground. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today, Alex Silvasatter and Bryce Parker in the control room with all their marvelous special effects with the frogs. And I always think that's kind of fun when we're able to do something special. Well, that's our show for today, and I want to thank you for joining us. Look for your blessings. They're always coming by. Bye for now.